Continuing our fiscal versus monetary policy discussion, let's talk about application here. And what we're really talking about is trying to keep the lows of the economy, like when you think of the Great Depression, trying to keep those lows from happening, but also trying to keep the really high highs like the late 1920s from happening as well, and trying to like even it out so that way it's not quite as bumpy. So that's kind of the idea, is managing what we call the business cycle, ups and downs, which historically have happened. And so that's the idea. So let's talk about the bad economy. First off, in a bad economy, you need to know that there's low demand. That means that people aren't buying things, and so prices drop. Matter of fact, you might even have something called deflation happening, where prices are dropping. And by the way, prices drop all the time, especially on certain goods. That happens all yearly, actually, seasonally. As a result, the one example I always give is that at the end of summer, you can get swimsuits and anything related to summer really cheap. There are price drops. Why? Because there's low demand. And demand is dropping because we're getting ready to go into the fall and people aren't buying beach things. So this natural aspect of prices drop happens in the economy. However, in a bad economy, this is happening pretty much across the board, and there's a low demand. So in a bad economy, low demand, that means people might lose their jobs. Unemployment rate is going to go up, and we're going to have some problems in our economy. So the government wants to like help that. So a couple things. What can the Federal Reserve do? So we bring in the Fed, and what's the Fed going to do? One, they're going to lower interest rates. They're going to lower interest rates. And the reason they're going to do that is the amount or the discount rate, what they charge banks to borrow money, for banks to borrow money from the Federal Reserve Bank. They're going to lower that so that way it encourages banks to make loans. To go along with that, the Fed is also going to increase the money supply. So the amount of money circulating in the economy. How do they do that? They make more money available to banks to borrow, so that way banks will then lend. So between the two things here, lowering interest rates, which by the way also encourages you and I to borrow from the bank. And if you and I borrow from the bank, maybe we'll buy a car. Maybe we'll buy a new washer and dryer. Maybe we'll buy a house. And by doing that, that's stimulating the economy. And if people are buying houses and cars and different types of technologies, then that will help create jobs. And so the Federal Reserve is trying to like manage this bad economy by lowering interest rates, increasing money supply, encouraging banks to lend. And then also, of course, one of the big things people borrow money for is to start a business. And of course, if they start a business, they may hire people, again, stimulating the economy. Down here on the fiscal side, we have the Keynesians, and the Keynesians are going to say increase government spending. So they're going to want government to spend. They're going to want to have different projects like we spoke in the first video, like rebuilding highways and bridges and different government buildings and welfare programs and things like that. And they believe that by putting this money out into the economy, this is also stimulating. Second, we have the supply siders. And the supply side says, well, government spending, that's not as effective. You have to tax, you have to take away from people. That's not as effective. So supply side says we should cut taxes. We should get more money in the pockets of people. People will then spend it. And when they spend it, that'll stimulate the economy because jobs will be created because people buy goods. The second thing they also say is deregulate. Make it easier for people to start a business. By starting a business, people will hire. By hiring, this will help unemployment, and then this will increase demand. So the bottom line here is that both the Fed and the Keynesians and the supply siders, they like have a philosophy about how to make a bad economy better. And this is talked about in our politics in the United States all the time. Now, in a good economy, understand this: there's high demand. In fact, one thing that might be happening is there is inflation. Prices are rising. And by the way, this isn't a bad thing. A little bit of inflation is a good thing. And the Federal Reserve doesn't mind if inflation is like 2% or 3%. That's like really good. Like we want a little bit of price demand because that means that demand is rising, that there's more economic activity happening, the money supply is increasing slowly. This is all very good. However, the Federal Reserve is worried that demand could get so high that inflation could go up really quick. And that could destroy savings. It could discourage savings. And it could also mean that people, like inflation is going up faster than wages, and people are actually falling behind. And that could cause a bad economy. Because if prices go up too fast, people will stop buying. In 2008, gasoline shot up to over $4 really quickly, along with housing market going up like crazy throughout the 2000s, early 2000s. And then in 2008, people just stopped buying and we had a huge crash. And that's just because the inflationary prices of housing and gasoline and all these things combined, people just stopped buying, and that caused a big crash. So the Federal Reserve would like to not have this happen on these extremes. And as you can see from the 2008 crash, it doesn't always do a good job at this. So what's the Fed do if they fear inflation? And then thus maybe a crash. So they fear inflation. Here's what they're going to do. One, they will raise interest rates. They'll kind of cool off the economy. They'll make it less likely that banks will loan money from them, and then therefore less likely because banks will end up raising their interest rates, and then therefore it's less likely that you're going to borrow money. So they kind of want to they want the economy to be going good, but they don't want the economy to be too good. Because if it's too good, that could cause inflation, and then that could cause a crash. So they're going to raise interest rates slowly. All right. Two, they're also going to decrease the money supply. So they want people to not borrow money as much, banks not borrow money from them, and then therefore people not borrow as much from banks. So this is a real key role in the economy. And in terms of like what does Keynesian believe and supply siders believe? Well, generally speaking, they would believe in doing the exact opposite of whatever they do during a bad economy. However, ideologically, for the most part, Republicans always think taxes being lower is better and deregulation is better. And Keynesians almost always argue for increases in government spending. And so like their prescription for a bad economy is really kind of their prescription for what keeps a good economy going. So either way, theoretically, yes, government spending should be cut during a good economy. That's certainly what Keynesian philosophy says, and there should be. Like if you were going to raise taxes, you'd want to do it during a good economy. So that kind of goes over good economy, bad economy. What I would do is I would make a T-chart and I would try to, from memory, create this and look back here. The one last thing that I wanted to hit on is high inflation. And just remember that if inflation is high, the Federal Reserve is going to increase interest rates and they're going to decrease the money supply because inflation is caused by money being worth less. And that could be caused by an economy really ramped up and hot and it's growing really fast. And so demand is high. Inflation could also be caused by the government printing too much money and having too much of a money supply, which is what happens at like, if you know Germany in the 1920s, they just printed money like crazy and inflation was insane. That's caused by government monetary policy. In the United States, we try to control that so it's not monetary policy. So if inflation goes up, it generally speaking has to do with demand. So anyway, just remember that. And there's also a practice millionaire on this that I would do as well.